Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Good, thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today in the lovely Galway. I've had the experience of being here with the Centre for Disability Law and Policy on a number of occasions, so it's lovely to be back again. I'm going to speak this afternoon on a disability-related topic. So I want to hone in on family support in the context of disability. And the opening statement, really, I want you to think about is whether family support in the context of disability is an undue burden, or who is it an undue burden for? Okay. The 5 key areas I'm going to look at in turn. So first of all, I want to set the scene, a little bit of background context. Who is it we're actually talking about? What is our unit of analysis, if you like? Then I'll move on to look at the role of macro systems, institutions, and frameworks. And I want to look at the extent to which they support or hinder the experiences of families who have members with disabilities. I then look at the rights-based framework. Why is it important to consider a rights-based framework? And some of the earlier speakers today have touched on this point, so it's really good to be able to build on that. And then the last 2 points is really about drawing those two things together. What the experiences of family support in the context of disability tell us about the implementation of rights? Are the rights of families, the rights of individuals with disabilities being effectively implemented and met? And I'll finish off by moving forward and making some of those connections. It would be very rude of me not to introduce my co-presenter. Thank you for already introducing Robin Clona. Robin, who does what she always does when I start to speak, is she lies down and she falls asleep, which says a lot about my presentation skills. Hopefully everyone here won't have fallen asleep by the end of my presentation like Robin. So Robin is my hearing dog. I'm a profoundly deaf academic. So Robin, I've only had her for 10 months. She alerts me to fire alarms, to doorbells, alarm clocks, anything that makes noises, essentially, comes over and nudges me and leads me to where the sound is. So she's been absolutely amazing so far. So now into the main business of things. Who is it we're talking about today in this session? So I want to look at family support in the context of disability. So it may be any member of the family that has a disability. It might include a child, children, a young person with a disability. It may be an adult with a disability who is part of the family, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent. It may be a family unit where a parent or both parents have a disability of some kind. I think it's important to remember when it comes to family support and the notion of caring that there is a spectrum of caring. So some family members may identify themselves as being a carer and provide quite a lot of physical support, for example. Others may provide emotional support or require quite intensive services. But again, there are other families where the caring might be quite subtle, or it might be quite invisible or indirect. So it's just important to recognise that for people with disability, there can be a very wide range when it comes to the types of support and caring that happens. A little bit on the context. We know that across the globe, the numbers of people with disabilities are increasing quite significantly. There are over 1 billion people across the globe who have a disability, according to the World Health Organization. That number is increasing for lots of different reasons. We might expect it to decrease because we've better medical technologies and interventions, but actually it's increasing. Reasons include the reduced infant mortality rates, young children living longer into adulthood, and we may have complex needs and require support and services. An aging population, older people are more likely to have a disability. And also a result of natural disasters and conflict that we see happening in different countries across the world. And all of those then contribute to a growing population of disability. It's interesting to see this reflected in Ireland. So the 2022 census showed that 1.1 million people identified themselves as having a disability, and that compares to just over 640,000 in 2016. So it's a relatively short period of time, and we're seeing the numbers increasing, again, for lots of reasons. I come across a research report when I was looking at today's presentation from the Department of Health in 2021, and that showed that the number of adults with intellectual disabilities living with family members is due to be 20% higher by 2032 than it was in 2017. Okay, so that's going to be a significant increase in the number of adults with intellectual disabilities who are living with their family members. So we see the result of children with disabilities, a range of disabilities, surviving into adulthood. And part of the result of that is they may live at home for longer periods of time. Research suggests that over 500,000 people in Ireland are family carers or who officially identify as family carers. Obviously, that's likely to be underestimated. But the other part of the jigsaw puzzle that I want to really focus on today is international human rights law. I know for some people, the eyes start to glaze over when we start to talk about law or international human rights law, but everything I'm going to be talking about today is very much from an applied perspective and very much impact on all of us here. Ireland ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1992, and they ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD, in 2018. Many of you may know about the CRC, but there may be fewer of you that know about the CRPD. And generally in society, more people are aware of the CRC compared to the CRPD. Before I go on to talk about the international human rights law side of things, I want to look at the evidence. So what does the evidence tell us about family support in the context of disability? And in doing that, I want to explore the roles of systems and structures and institutions, and whether or not they support families who have members with disabilities, or whether they in fact hinder the support available for families of people with disabilities. So do they challenge inequalities, or do they reinforce inequalities? So first of all, we know that globally there has been a shift from state responsibility to family and community responsibility. In the context of disability, there's been a move towards deinstitutionalisation, so people with disabilities moving out of long-stay institutions and hospitals and into the community. And what that has meant is that families are now taking on caring responsibility for members who may have a disability, whether that be a child or an adult. So that kind of support might mean things like looking after services, it might mean physical support, emotional support, buying equipment, facilities, there's all kinds of support that I'm talking about here. And the family member often acts as a mediator or a facilitator of that kind of support. And one of the reasons for that shift has been in order to reduce the so-called burden on the state, or to reduce the so-called cost of providing that support and services on the state. So then we begin to think about, well, what does this mean for disability? Does it mean that people with disabilities are therefore a burden on the state? Are they a burden on our society if we have to spend lots of money in providing support and services for people with disabilities? And we often see that language reflected in policy and legislation, that notion of undue or unreasonable burden. We also know that systems, structures, institutions in and around disability and the family, they have not been designed by people with disabilities themselves. Okay? They have not been designed with disability in mind. When we think of traditionally how policies and services have been designed, they've been designed by a majority non-disabled population. And majority non-disabled adult population. Okay? And a result of that is that policies and services have tended to be based on non-disabled and ableist norms, or assumptions about what a good citizen should look like, what a good citizen looks like in our society, or a normal citizen looks like, and what they should do and contribute to in our society. The research also shows that there is a distinct lack of adequate support and services for families with members who have disabilities. It shows that the type and quality of support is very inconsistent. So the research I referred to here includes Irish research, but also global research. So it reflects the global trend of what is happening in this area. For children with disabilities and their families, we know that there is a lack of child-friendly support. The research shows that service provision for adults with disabilities and their families is often fragmented. There's a lack of coordination. It's not always effective or based on family or individual needs. We see families feeling disempowered from the system, that they feel silenced by the system. They're not given a voice or a role to contribute what services and support might look like or what would help them best. But in essence, have to choose from what is already on offer, even though it's not been designed by them, but have to choose from a menu, if you like, of something that is already in place. We see the silencing of individuals with disabilities in the process, of individuals with a range of disabilities, and also of children with disabilities. There's assumptions, deeply embedded assumptions, that children with disabilities don't have the capacity to express their views, that they're too expensive to access their views, or take too much time to access their views. But actually, that's our responsibility rather than the child's responsibility. It's our responsibility to access those views. Families, as a result, have had to rely heavily on informal, ad hoc support and networks in order to try and achieve a reasonable standard of living or well-being for themselves and also for members with disabilities. The additional cost of caring in disability, this is an absolute critical issue that needs to be looked at. There has been quite a bit of research in this area, and there's more emerging research in this area, particularly given the pandemic, the financial crisis, the cost of living crisis. These issues have become more heightened in recent years. So what are we talking about in this regard? Well, there are additional costs for individuals with disabilities and their families to achieve the same standard of living as someone without a disability. So it might cost more money in order to undertake the same activities or to do the same things. So those are referred to the additional cost of disability. In a recent report published by the Department of Social Protection, it was done in 2021, found that these additional costs were estimated to be between €8,700 and €12,300 per year. So if you think about what you may already spend in a year and then add that on top, you can see how and why families with disabled members are much more likely to be in poverty compared to those without disability. Have a think about whether financial benefits cover the extent of these costs. So I'm sure you can work it out monthly and in terms of what's available, does it cover these additional costs of disability? A more recent recalculation has been undertaken, taking into account the high levels of inflation, and that suggests that actually the additional cost of disability is now between €10,379 and €14,673. So it's a huge dent on a family income. Again, these may include disability-specific goods or equipment, home adaptations, specialised care services, or higher levels of spending if you're spending more on electricity, for example, or specialist clothing, or more money on heating, for example, to look after someone with a particular condition. Even if you think of children with disabilities, if they want a bicycle for Christmas from Santa Claus and they have a physical disability, they may have to spend more in order to get an accessible bicycle or an accessible toy, which are very, very expensive compared maybe to a sibling, where it may be cheaper to get them toys. So if we think again about the language of the undue burden, is it the disabled young person or individual who is the burden? Or is it how things are costed in our society? Is it about the benefits or the extent or limited benefits that are provided that is actually the burden on these individual families? I want to now move on to talk briefly, you'll be glad to hear, about the value of a rights-based framework and international law. So I'll be keeping an eye out in case the eyes start glazing over and you do a robbing. On a word of warning, I could stand here and talk for days about human rights. Probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. So I think it's really important to look at family support in the context of disability with a rights-based lens. And it's something that we don't do very often, that we don't do enough. We very rarely do when it comes to disability generally across the world. We know that children and adults with disabilities have rights under the UNCRC. They also have rights under the UNCRPD. What does it mean to have rights? Well, you don't have to actually do anything to achieve your rights. You don't have a responsibility. Rights don't come with responsibility. That's a complete myth that we are taught. There are no responsibilities or things we actually have to do to enjoy our rights. It is up to the state to implement or put in practice various measures or actions, policies, services, support, in order that individuals can enjoy their rights. So it means that the state and all of us who are employed by the state become a duty bearer under these international human rights treaties. So if we are employed by the state, then we should really become very familiar with these human rights treaties. Why is it important? Why should we bother? Apart from the fact we have an obligation, which we know some countries across the world sign up to these documents, but then just forget about them, or just leave them to the side, or use them as a checkbox exercise. In the disability context, there are lots of really significant reasons why this is so valuable and critical for us. Rights play a really key role in making visible that which has long been suppressed. It shines a light on various types of oppression that marginalised groups in our society face or have experienced. It uncovers various forms of discrimination. It provides us with a framework or a way of understanding the lived experiences of different groups, of socially created obstacles in society, and it takes the emphasis away from the individual person and places it on structural inequality, on the roles of our systems and institutions and structures. So it allows us to identify the barriers that exist there, rather than focusing on the individual. For people with disabilities, whether it's children or adults, using the language of rights is really important because it disrupts the long-held mainstream narrative that people with disabilities are in need of protection, care, or cure. It's a much more empowering language to use. It disrupts that narrative that people with disabilities are burdens because of their health condition or their disability. Okay? So it disrupts the idea that I'm a burden because I require certain support. I might require a lift system in the room, okay, that may cost the institution money. Might require a flash and fire alarm in a room when I'm teaching back home. Yes, that costs the university money. I could be seen as a burden, but actually it's not about that. It's about entitlements and rights. So rights are not a gift or a luxury. They are fundamental entitlements that we all have. So what kind of rights are relevant when it comes to family support, or what has the United Nations said about family support? Well, if we look at the CIPD, we can see a number of references to the importance of the family and the support that they should be achieving. For example, the preamble, or the front part, the beginning of the CIPD, it makes it clear that the family is entitled to protection by society and the state, and the persons with disabilities and their family members should receive the necessary protection and assistance to enable families to contribute towards the full and equal enjoyment of the rights of persons with disabilities. Article 23 of the CIPD makes it clear that states have the responsibility to provide early and comprehensive information, services and support to children with disabilities and their families. Article 28 of the CIPD again recognises the rights of persons with disabilities to an adequate standard of living for themselves and for their families, and to the continuous improving of living conditions, and to take appropriate steps to safeguard and promote the realisation of this right without discrimination on the basis of disability. However, there's a lack of evidence, there's a lack of discussion that is framed around family support and disability rights, and that's something that we need to start thinking about more. Research has shown us that rights have long been deemed irrelevant for people with disabilities. We don't need to talk about rights, they're completely irrelevant to us. We don't have rights. We should be focused on getting better. We should be focused on being as normal as possible and fitting into a society that's already designed by non-disabled people. So, right job by disrupting that. There has been discussion already today about participation, engagement in policy-making processes. The CIPD is very clear that individuals, adults and children with disabilities must be involved in decision-making processes about things that impact on them. So that includes policies, it includes services, it includes support. Article 4.3 of the CIPD makes it clear that state parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities. And they should do so in the development and implementation of legislation and policies. Article 7 of the CIPD is very focused on children, and that gives children with disabilities the right to express their views freely on all matters affecting them. It's not just about expressing their views, they also have to have their views given due weight. So something has to happen to those views. We have to take those views on board in accordance with the age and maturity on an equal basis with other children, and to be provided with disability and age-appropriate assistance in realising that right. So what does that mean for family support then? We should be listening to and talking to children and adults with disabilities and their families about what that should look like. I think it's quite a strong quote about the power of human rights. So Jack Donnelly argues that human rights claims express not merely aspirations. It's not about suggestions or requests. It's not about laudable ideas, but the rights-based demands for change. So I want to now bring those two elements together. So family support and disability, what we know, the rights-based elements, and see how we can make them work together. So what can we learn about the state of rights around family and disability support? The CIPD is a critical entitlement framework that we all should be using within our work, whether we are practitioners, whether we are academics, whether we are policymakers. It has relevance for all of us here in the room today. And it will only work if we use it. It's more than just a piece of paper. Paper doesn't do anything. We need to actually do something with it. The CIPD is widely recognised as a paradigm shift. I really like this quote from Gerard Quinn, originally from Galway Centre for Disability Law and Policy, who was involved in the drafting of the CIPD. He argued that the real value of the convention will be revealed in how governments, human rights organisations, services and organisations of and for people with disabilities internalise their values, their principles and their rules. So these are rights that are bestowed on the individual with a disability, but they also have implications for families as a unit. If an individual with a disability's rights are not met, then it's going to have an impact on the extent of family support that is required or how effective family support is. If family support isn't provided in the correct way, if it's not being effective, then that will impact on the rights of the individual with a disability and also on the family unit. And whether or not families may feel they have to fight for the rights or fight for support for the family member. So what I want all of us to think about in the context of family support and disability is to what extent are the values and principles of the CIPD and the CIC manifest in services and support. What are the barriers to the realisation of these rights across services and support? So when we have a think about, well, when's the last time I remember the CIPD being mentioned or the principles being used in my service, or whether you're academics or whether you're policymakers? Using a rights-based framework shows us that families with disabled members experience discrimination. Okay? They experience inequality, they experience multiple forms of discrimination. Basically, institutional and systemic discrimination. They also experience intersectional discrimination, and we need to pay more attention to the way in which a person with a disability who requires support isn't just an individual person, but they're also male or female. They also come from particular backgrounds, from particular areas, from socioeconomic backgrounds. We need to think about how different identities intersect with disability to put families in a particular position or circumstance and the particular services that may be required. So to what extent is it recognised that families who have members with disabilities experience discrimination? To what extent is the language around that couched in those terms? It's about respect and human dignity and equality. Using those terms are central to the implementation of the CIPD. I've talked already about the language of undue burden, and we know that burden is a heavy load, something that's difficult to carry. And the traditional narrative has been that it's the individual who is a burden because they have a health condition and that we have to look after them or provide care to everyone with a disability or provide particular kinds of support that might be expensive. Okay? And we might do it begrudgingly. You think, oh, actually, that's really expensive. That's an unreasonable request to ask. And I'm sure both of us here have had experiences of that in various contexts in the past. But in human rights terms, the undue burden is about how the rights of individuals with disabilities are not being met. The undue burden is about the implementation gap in rights. It's not about the individual. It's about systemic barriers and inequalities and structure. That's where the undue burden lies. And it's undue or unreasonable not for society, but it's undue or unreasonable for the individual person with a disability and their family. Okay? Nobody obviously asked to have a disability. We all have equal worth. So therefore, it's important to shift our thinking as to who or what is the burden around it. And what we are seeing is many examples of families taking on the role of the duty bearer. The duty bearer should be the state. But families are taking on this role and providing formal or informal support for their family member with a disability, rather than acting as rights holders, because they may feel there's no alternative. The final key point I want to make is the importance of co-production and voice. So you've already seen the comments on the slide by the CIPD about the importance of voice. And when we talk about voice, it's not just about verbal voice, but it's about verbal and non-verbal ways of expressing voice for both children and adults with disabilities, and recognising and supporting their capacity. I'll put a diagram up there of a good starting point that some of you may recognise the Lundy model from my colleague Laura Lundy from Queen's, who argues in order to support people to express views, you need to provide support, you need to provide space, voice, allow them to express a view, but there also need to be an audience in order to influence what is happening. You need to do something with that view. I think that's quite a useful starting point if we are taking into account the views of people with disabilities. So final key takeaways then. The three things that I really want you to go away with, including a desire to learn more about international human rights law. So firstly, families that include children or adults with disabilities are experiencing significant challenges. This needs to be couched in rights-based terms. It's about a general failure to effectively implement and support the rights of children and adults with disabilities. It's about a lack of understanding about what rights look like and how they work, generally and for people with disabilities. And people with disabilities and their families must be empowered as rights holders and have a role to play in what services should look like. They need to have a role in the design of these services. In terms of moving forward, I just leave you with those 4 points. Applying rights-based language, returning the responsibility for rights to where they belong, to duty bearers, voice, and all of us here in the room have a critical role to play in facilitating access for people with disabilities and their families. So on behalf of Robin and I will leave it there. So thank you very much and happy to take any questions.